Hello and welcome to the Sitecore Commerce 8 powered by Microsoft Dynamics quick installation video. The goals for this video are first off to install a developer machine installation, as well as understanding how Sitecore and Microsoft Dynamics AX Retail work together. For the developer machine installation, we'll be choosing minimal security configuration, so do not use this video as a reference for running this installation in production. We'll be using administrator accounts, we'll be using default passwords and exposed passwords. So this is really truly to install as quickly as possible and to understand how the component pieces work together. So the prerequisites for this installation are first off the normal prerequisites for a Sitecore installation itself. So that includes having a Windows machine that meets the criteria for a Sitecore installation, as well as IIS and SQL Server. MongoDB is an optional component for a Sitecore installation, however, it's required for this particular integration. And lastly, you'll need a Microsoft Dynamics AX Retail instance. So we'll spend a couple minutes understanding the architecture before we get into the details, as well as the list of all the installation steps and dependencies that we'll be using for the install. And this is really important to understand all the moving parts because there are a number of them. If you're familiar with Sitecore and you're familiar with Commerce Server or Commerce Connect, some of this will be repeated. However, if you're new to any of these, we'll take a few minutes to go through the components. So first off, we'll take a look at the left here. And here we have our Sitecore stack. So we have our Sitecore installation, and that in turn also has a number of dependencies in the background: IIS, SQL Server, MongoDB. As we mentioned, this is a simplified architecture. And on top of Sitecore, we have Commerce Connect. And Commerce Connect is really the framework. It's essentially middleware that enables a lot of commerce operations. And we use it internally for integrating with Commerce Server. And we also use it for integrating with Microsoft Dynamics. And we have a number of partners that have built on top of that for other third-party integrations. And so within Commerce Connect, you have layered on Commerce Server Connect, and these are some of the pipelines that are necessary for talking to Commerce Server, and I'll explain why that's required. And then you also have Commerce Connect for Dynamics Retail, and what that does is it essentially enables pipelines for ensuring that the transactional information, so that is shopping carts, orders, any profile information, that gets properly routed to Microsoft Dynamics AX. Another thing we have here is the commerce indexes that are necessary. So that would be either Lucene or Solar, and that's really required for indexing that content. And the reference storefront lives on top of this entire stack. That's the front end. It's an MVC application, basically used to display the content. You can search, you can use faceted navigation. That's really a good example implementation that is built on top of Commerce Connect and also using those commerce indexes. Now, the transaction framework I mentioned, that basically ensures that all of that transactional information gets routed to Microsoft Dynamics AX. One thing as well is there is something known as the routing framework, and what that does is it's shown very simply here in this diagram, but it's actually a very complex process for taking the information that exists in that Microsoft Dynamics AX repository and transforming that and mapping that into the Commerce Server repository, which is then accessed and exposed into Sitecore through a data provider. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is looking at this routing framework, and there are a number of ways to kick off a routing process. The default way is a scheduled task within Sitecore that'll basically say, right, once a week, go and pull that information from Dynamics and pull that into Commerce Server. Although you can have console apps, and there is an SDK that has a console app, and we'll be using that to test our installation and actually show you a bit more of what's going on in that routing framework. And there's also other ways that you can call that as well through web service, for example. And so there are a number of examples in how the routing framework is used, but the point of all that is really just to say, right, what routing achieves is taking that information in the Dynamics AX instance, transforming that and importing that into Commerce Server, where it can then be used in Sitecore and through the rest of the stack. So let's take a look at the dependencies here. So first you have Sitecore 8.0, and I'm going to be using update 5. Next we have Commerce Server 11, the latest version, that is update 1. And on top of that, we're going to install Commerce Connect. And then we're going to install Commerce Server Connect, and these are pieces that are necessary for talking to Commerce Server for the catalog and through that data provider. Next, we'll be installing the Sitecore Commerce Dynamics Integration Connect, and these are really the pieces that are necessary to hook up those Sitecore pipelines with the transaction service. So that's any of the card operations or profile management or order management. Next, we'll install the Merchandising Manager, and that is an optional step. I will point out for the integration with Microsoft Dynamics AX Retail that this is a read-only operation. So if you install Merchandising Manager to look at information coming from a Commerce Server catalog, normally that's a two-way operation. In our case here, because the information is a one-way push from Microsoft Dynamics to Sitecore, we disable the Merchandising Manager and make that into a read-only. So you can use it to navigate through products and hierarchies, but you can't use it to make changes. Next, we'll look at the solution storefront, and that zip file contains the solution storefront itself. There are a few packages within there, as well as the images that are necessary for the example content that we're using from Microsoft Dynamics. And lastly, we'll download the Routing Framework SDK from the developer network, and we'll use that for the console app. And there are actually a few SDKs here that are available on the website, but we're just going to use this one. So for our first steps, we're going to install Sitecore and Commerce Server. And so for the Sitecore installation, before we do that, we'll go and check that XDB is up and running. Next, we'll do a quick check on a registry entry setting for the web config. So we need to ensure that the web config can be large enough to accommodate the additional entries necessary for Commerce Server and Microsoft Dynamics. And then the next step is actually to install Commerce Server, and it's a somewhat simplified installation of Commerce Server. We only need to install Commerce Server itself, and when we do install the Commerce Server site, we really need to only configure the catalog portion of Commerce Server. So there are additional services that Commerce Server does typically install around profile management and order management. Because we're using the profile management and the order management and the basket operations for Microsoft Dynamics AX, we don't need to configure those parts of the Commerce Server installation, but we do need to install the portion that we are using, and that is the catalog, which we're using as an edge cache. So first things first, we're going to check on Mongo and SQL Server to ensure that the databases are up and running and we have the appropriate permissions as necessary. So for Mongo, we're basically just going to use something like RoboMongo and connect to the default local host in the default Mongo port, which is 27017, and we'll connect there, and we can see that the database is reachable and there's a local database and a number of system collections. We don't have the XDB ones set up yet because Sitecore installation will take care of that for us. Next, we'll go and take a look at SQL Server. So we'll launch SQL Management Studio. And we'll ensure that we have an account that has DBO rights to read and write and create those databases as necessary for Sitecore. And if you don't have those permissions, you should just create an account with that. Typically for developer installation, I just use Sitecore and Sitecore. So we'll connect. and we'll create a new login. And we'll make that a SQL Server login. And we'll ensure that they have those sysadmin rights. And so at this point we can use that Sitecore account to run the Sitecore install, and it will create those databases under that account. Okay, so at this point we're going to launch the Sitecore installer, and we will accept the terms of the license agreement, do a complete install, ignoring the error message around the web client service, and we'll call this Commerce 8 AX, and pick a license file that has the necessary components enabled, and we'll choose that Sitecore account that we just created. And at this point we'll install to that default directory within IIS, CINET pub www root. Call the website name Commerce8AX as well, and go and complete that installation process. So you can see Sitecore giving a status indication as it installs the application, and then when that's done we will just simply launch it to ensure that it installed correctly. Okay, so now that that's complete, we'll choose the Launch Sitecore checkbox and hit Finish, and that will simply launch a browser and load up Sitecore. First time you load up Sitecore, of course, like any IIS web application, it takes a couple minutes to spin up, and it'll do that. And so we'll pause this until that's complete. Okay, so Sitecore is launched, and so we'll type in the super secure Sitecore admin default password, and we'll make sure that Sitecore is up and running. And that's it for now. And so next step is to check on the registry entry for the web config settings, and then the following step after that will be to install Commerce Server itself. Okay, so next we're going to launch regedit. And we will go and take a look at the registry entry key, which is HKLM software Microsoft INET STP. So HKey local machine, and we have here configuration, and we can see here that we have the entry max web config file size in KB, and that has a value of 500 decimal. And what that does is that allows a 500 kilobyte web config entry. Ours won't be quite that large, but the default is a fair bit smaller than this, so what we're doing is we're just adding that to extend the default web config entry size. And that's it. So next we're going to install Commerce Server itself, and so we'll double click that exe and that will launch the installer. And then after we install the program, we're going to go through the configuration of adding a site within Commerce Server, and that site will in fact store our catalog that will be coming from Microsoft Dynamics AX. So we've got the installer here, and we will click the install button, and accept the license agreement, and it will be installing the program, and after it installs the program it will launch the configuration. Okay, so we now have our Commerce Server configuration wizard, and we will configure our admin database. We're just going to use Windows authentication, and we're logged in as the administrator user who should have access to that, but we'll test the connection. Now, we aren't using the Commerce Server staging for this. However, you do need to enter an account to set up that service. We won't configure a virtual route for staging. And of course, this is giving us the warning that this is a fairly insecure installation, and we know that because we are doing a developer install. But obviously in production, you would go through and configure those roles for each of those services appropriately. So we will say yes to proceed with that account and click next and continue the configuration process for the install. Okay, so that process of configuration of Commerce Server is complete. So we'll click Finish. And we'll click Exit. Okay, so we can verify within SQL Server that we have that administration database set up. So we've gone ahead and checked that. And then the next step is basically creating a folder within the inetpub directory. So we're going to call this AX Services. So we'll make a new folder. And we will enter that. And we'll also set up a hosts entry for that, as well as within IIS setting up a self-signed certificate, because we need to have HTTPS for the transaction service between our Sitecore site and Microsoft Dynamics AX. So we're going to go to C, Windows, System 32, Drivers, etc hosts, and we will launch and edit that with Notepad. So we're going to make a new entry. For AX CS services, and I'll make sure that that's what I had here, so I'm going to rename this so the two match up. And then next we're going to add a reference to ax.reference.storefront.com, and that is for our storefront site itself. And we'll save that, and we'll now go and we'll launch IIS. Okay, so we've launched our IIS manager here, and first thing we're going to do is create a new site, and we will call that AXCS Services, and we will point to the AXCS Services directory, and we will also add that new host name as well, and we'll leave that at port 80. And we will start that site. We'll refresh that and see that here. And then the next step is to go to our base site and create a server certificate. And we're going to create a self-signed certificate. And we're going to give that the name ax.reference.storefront.com. And say OK. And for that Sitecore site that we set up, we're going to add some bindings for that as well. So we'll say add HTTP and that host reference name, and add HTTPS also with that host reference name, and we'll pick that same self-signed server certificate and say OK and close. And that's it for those IIS steps. Okay, so for step 2, what we're going to do now is install the Commerce Server site itself. One small note here that there is a one-to-one relationship between a Commerce Server site and a Sitecore site. I should point out that you can have Sitecore Commerce powered by Commerce Server and Sitecore Commerce powered by Microsoft Dynamics installed on the same server, and it's the same Commerce Server installation. You install that once, but then you would install a separate Commerce Server site for Dynamics AX and a separate Commerce Server site for Sitecore Commerce Server. And then those in turn, each of those are pointing to separate Sitecore instances. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to unpack, also known as unpup, that Commerce Server site, and then we'll do a few post-install steps with regards to setting permissions for those services IS sites that we set up earlier, and we'll enable the business tools for that catalog manager. And then at that point we will import a catalog which will be our base catalog before we get the routing synchronization working with our Microsoft Dynamics AX instance. Okay, so we're back here to our install files, and within that I have unzipped that file that we got from GitHub that has the reference storefront. And within that, not only do we have the packages for the reference storefront, but we also have in this database directory a catalog import XML file that we'll be importing in a few steps, as well as this pup directory. And so what we're going to do now is we will double click on this solution storefront.pup to start that unpackaging procedure. And so what we're going to do here is we'll choose custom unpack, and we will create a new site, and we're going to call this the AX solution storefront site. And go through all the steps here, and we can see here that it's going to create a number of databases, and it's going to give us those database names as well as all of the web services. Now we can choose just to install all of them, but to be perfectly frank, all we do need is this catalog web service. So I'm going to turn all the rest off, and we will choose here that AX CS Services IS website that we created earlier, and next, and this will now go through the process of unpacking that Commerce Server site for us. Okay, so it's partially through the unpacking process. It's prompting us now to specify profile import files or XML files for profile definitions and site terms and other expressions. We're just going to leave all of this as it is and basically click next twice, and it will continue that install process. All right, and as before, again, when we're going to see a lot of security related messages as we go through this, and it's basically just saying that these are configured to use Windows integrated authentication. It does give you the option, and again, in a production environment you would probably configure these services individually to have those permissions very much restricted to only those parts of the application that they need to have permission to. But we will say OK, and we'll continue that, and we can now see here that we have created a number of databases, so you can see those there, and we've created the additional application at that IIS site that we set up earlier. So we'll say finish, and now if we go to inetpub and AXCS services, we can see here that there is in fact a site that has been created. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and go through the post-install steps. So the first is we're going to set the app pool user in IIS to use that administrator account, and the next step is to add that self-same administrator account to the authorization manager so that we can now access that service. And then the next thing is we'll ensure that we can access the service and launch the catalog manager and import the catalogs using the catalog manager. Okay, so we have IAS open here, and we can see that underneath the AXCS services website, we have one application, and that is the catalog web service. And if we take a look at the advanced settings here, we can see that we're using the AXCS services app pool. So we're going to go to that app pool, and we're going to change the identity here from application pool identity to the administrator account. So we'll go to the advanced services and click on identity and set the custom account, and we'll type in the administrator account and the password. And say OK and OK, so that is now applied. You also need to confirm the authentication settings, and so if you double click on that, confirm that anonymous authentication is disabled and that Windows authentication is enabled. Now the next step is we're going to launch the authorization manager, and so we'll type azman.msc, and that will come up with that. And we can see here that we have no authorization stores selected. So we'll go and say Open Authorization Store and select that. And we'll go to INET-Pub, AXCS Services, and the Catalog Authorization Store XML file. And then underneath Role Assignments, there is a Catalog Administrator. And we will assign the administrator user to that. And that's it. So now we can go back to IIS and click on the content view and the catalog web service.asmx, and we will click browse and launch that. Okay, so we can see here that it is prompting us for access to this directory. Now this is actually caused by the fact that I'm running this within a virtual machine. And so there's a couple solutions to this. There is either a registry entry fix that you can disable loopback, or you can set the domain AX services to be accessible. The other potential solution is to edit the bindings here and add a port of 1000. And so what this allows us to do then is, instead of calling this by the domain AXCS services, we'll just do localhost 1000. And you can see now that the web service is accessible there. So we're going to copy that URL, and we're going to go to the catalog manager. So to launch that, type in catalog and launch the Commerce Server Catalog Manager. And you can see here that it's prompting you to indicate that that default URL is unavailable, and that's okay. We'll click edit, and we will paste in our address, which is slightly different in that it just has the port there that we copied from the URL that worked, and say OK, and OK a second time, and then at this point it will open up the catalog manager. So what we're going to do now is say import catalog, and we'll go to browse, and we'll go to our install files and to our reference storefront directory, and then underneath database you can see catalog here, and you can see that we have our reference storefront for dynamic sample catalog. And so we will open that, and we will choose a replace import, and we will click next and create. And so now that's finished, and you can just say finish, and we will refresh and see all of our catalogs here. And there is that base catalog that we have. Now, when we do our first synchronization from the Microsoft Dynamics AX Live instance, you will see additional catalogs here as well. And that's one of the ways that you can know that that synchronization has succeeded, aside from looking at the log files, obviously. So at this point, we now have a number of packages and update packages to install. So first off, we're going to install Commerce Connect. So that is first the base Commerce Framework package. And on top of that, we'll install the update package for Commerce Server Connect. And what that will do is add a number of Commerce Server specific additions, specifically around the data provider for the communication between Sitecore and Commerce Server. And then we'll install the Microsoft Dynamics Connect package. And what that will do is add pipelines and code specific for routing all of the operations, such as user profile operations and cart and order operations through the transaction service. We'll be installing the transaction service itself, and we'll be installing the routing service, and also installing the console application to go along with the routing service. And so those will be fairly detailed installs that we'll get into. Next, we'll install the merchandising manager. That is an optional package. When you install that with Dynamics AX, the merchandising manager actually becomes read-only. So that is why this is an optional install, because we consider Microsoft Dynamics AX to be the single source of truth for that commerce content that's coming in. And then lastly, we'll install the reference Storefront MVC application. Now, a number of these, such as the transaction service and the routing service and the reference Storefront, have some detailed sub-steps that we'll get into, but this is really at a high level what we're going through for basically step 3, which is bringing all of these various components together and configuring them, essentially wiring up all the applications to talk to each other. So we're going to log into Sitecore here, and we'll choose to go to the desktop. And installation wizard. And we're going to choose the package and upload. And I have all my installation files in this install files directory, and we're going to choose Sitecore Commerce Connect and say next and upload and select that and say open. And at this point, click next and accept the license agreement and review the installation steps and say next and install that. Okay, so that install is complete, and we'll restart the Sitecore client. Okay, so next we're going to launch the Update Installation Wizard, and what this will do is this is similar to the package install, but the big difference is that the Update Installation Wizard adds a number of things like post-installation steps. So that's why we'll see some of these packages that we're installing are actual Sitecore packages. Others are run through the Update Installation Wizard. So we're going to choose, and we're going to see here this .update file. So this is Sitecore Commerce Server Connect, so we will choose that and say open, and view package information, analyze and install, and in this case we're going to say install the package, and we'll run through this installation and come back to this when it's completed. Okay, so we can see here that the installation is completed, so we can go to installation result. So we're going to choose another file, and at this point here we will choose sitecore.commerce.dynamicsintegration.connect, and we will run through that package here. We can see the package license information, analyze and install, and in this case we will just go straight to install. Okay, this is done, and we can go to installation results and take a look at the results, and then next we will install the transaction service. Now, before we actually install the transaction service, I just wanted to go back to our PowerPoint here and look at what the transaction service actually is. And what it is it's a package that we're going to install, and what it will do is it will install a web application within our Sitecore directory. And it has a number of web service endpoints that our pipelines will call, and it in turn has a number of application settings because it will be doing two things. It will be opening channel DB connections to Microsoft Dynamics, and it will also occasionally be making real-time service calls to Microsoft Dynamics, and those two communication channels depend upon the nature of the call. So for something like a price request, it's going to be requesting that from the channel DB. For something like a real-time service call, that would be something like a profile save to the external Microsoft Dynamics AX service. And so there are two communication methods, and we'll be configuring both of those. So the first step is to actually install that package that we'll do, and then we'll go through and we'll modify a number of settings within those config files and other parts of the application. Okay, so we're back at our update installation wizard, and we're going to choose a file and pick the transaction service update package, and we'll say open, and again view the readme and say analyze and install, and we'll install that package. And that is complete, and so we'll look at the installation result and choose to install another package. And we'll come back to this because we still have a number of update packages to install. But we will take a look now at the config files that this has done, and we now also have to do some work within IIS. Okay, so the transaction service has actually installed a folder underneath our Sitecore website called transaction service, and within that we have web.config and commerce runtime.config. So we'll go and take a look at those here first. So first off, the web.config, we have this connection string. This is a SQL connection string that you need to make to your Microsoft Dynamics database. So we'll have the server name here in the database as well as the security information as required. Within commerce runtime.config, we have a default operating unit number. This is really to point to a specific operating unit within your channel database. And then lastly, in the root of your Sitecore site, under app config, you have Dynamics Retail Connector Services.config. And what these do is these actually point to your transaction service itself. So this is your Sitecore installation being configured to point to this transaction service. And so this transaction service could actually be potentially on a different Sitecore machine. In this case, it's just pointing to itself. Now, if I go and I try to access this service, we can see here that as it is configured currently, there are web config settings that are preventing us from accessing this properly. So that's one thing to note. We still have some post-installation steps to get this to function. Next, you can also see here that the channel service ID, this is the channel ID that you will be accessing within your Microsoft Dynamics AX channel database. And so if you have a different channel database number, you need to configure that and change that here within this config file as well. Okay, so a few more steps here with regards to the transaction service. So first off, we're going to go to our Sitecore site and we're going to refresh this, and we can now see our transaction service here, and we're going to say convert to application. So we will do that. That's the first step. The second step is to take a look at our hosts file. So remember I said earlier that sometimes the transaction service is connecting to the channel database directly through SQL. Sometimes it's making a call to a service. Occasionally the SQL database returns a service listing and a URL to make that real-time request. And so we sometimes need to ensure that the URL that's coming back has a valid domain, and if it doesn't, on the Sitecore machine, we may need to configure a host entry. So in my case here, I have a host entry for retail.contoso.com, which is that URL that's coming back. And so I need to set up a host entry for that, so when we get this named domain back, we can actually map that to a real server that exists. So that's the first thing. And then the last thing is within IIS to make sure that our Sitecore site has a HTTPS binding, because the transaction service communicates over SSL, therefore it needs to have an HTTPS binding. So if you haven't done that already, to make sure you have configured that as well for it. So next we'll install the routing framework, and this actually consists of two update packages. And looking here at the architecture, we can sort of break it down a little bit. So the first is the routing service package itself, and what that installs is the framework. And the routing service is something that could be potentially reused in other Sitecore products, and so therefore there's kind of that default framework that you install, similar to how you install Commerce Connect first. Now next, after that, you install the routing framework package that's specific to Dynamics AX, and that will install a number of the code and the routes and steps that are particular to the transform of the data that's coming out of AX into the data that we need for Commerce Server. And so that's what we're going to install now, is those two packages, and configure that within Sitecore to talk to Dynamics AX. So step one, we'll click on Choose File, and we will install that default routing framework. And again, we'll look at the package information and go through the remainder of the install steps. All right, so that's installed, and we'll install the AX specific steps in the routing framework. So again, choose files, and you can see here sitecore.commerce.dynamicsintegration.routing. So we will install that. Okay, so we've now got the installation result for the routing framework information that's specific to Dynamics itself. Now the next step is to look at the web config and do a merge, and there's a few things that we need to merge. First of all, we're bringing in those entries that are relevant to Commerce Server. Then we're also bringing in those entries that are relevant to the transaction service. Now there's some trickiness because the transaction service, being a child web config entry from the main web config, expects things in a certain container, and some things within the Telerik RAD editor and Sitecore expect other things in a different portion. And so what I'm going to do for the web config is, short of actually going through the config merging line by line, the instructions are out there. I'm going to do a diff between the two files and really just point out those things that you need to see and know. Okay, so the first thing that we have here is a couple additional sections for Commerce Server at the top of the web config. And then the biggest change that you'll notice, and you don't really notice here in ExamDiff, but you would certainly notice in Visual Studio or any other editor that can work with XML, is that we have this location path that basically wraps the majority of the web config. And what that does is that hides a lot of these things from the child application there. So that's what that wrapper does. Now, what that also does in turn is there's a few things that need to be outside of this location path. For example, Telerik is expecting its entries to be in the root of the web config. So if we go to the very bottom, and we'll see here that we can see some of these Telerik entries on the left-hand side. We'll see this fairly soon. So we can see all these modules here. These effectively get moved, and the majority of the system web server stuff stays wrapped in that location control, except for these handlers we hide here. These HTTP modules and handlers get hidden in our new web config and basically copied and moved outside of our location, and this new system web server is added to the bottom. Now there's some additional handlers and additional installation that was done to support the solution storefront, so WebGrease, Castle Windsor, System Razor, etc., etc. Normally we wouldn't be seeing these now. Normally these would be in a merge step after the solution storefront, but I'm just pointing those out now. And so those are really a lot of the big change differences, and you'll also see a section specific around additional session states, so we've added that there as well. And there's probably some stuff here around Commerce Server, so you can see here we've got those additional assemblies necessary for Commerce Server, as well as Microsoft Dynamics controls. And then of course you have your Commerce Server section unto itself, and this is where the binding between our Sitecore instance and our AX instance occurs. And so we're basically calling the AX solution here by name, and so this is where and why you can have multiple Sitecore Commerce Server sites on the same machine as multiple Sitecore installations. And so we're binding a Sitecore installation to a Commerce Server site, and in this case here we're binding our Sitecore installation to our Commerce Server site that we're setting up specifically to support that AX catalog that's coming in. And you can see here as well there's a few of the e-commerce controls, and this is again coming from the solution storefront site and effectively saying how we're calling that transaction service to make a number of these cart operations. So you can see there's shopping cart, checkout, product availability, loyalty, and customer service as well. And so those are the big web config changes. I'm going to, now that you've seen this, I'm going to install the solution storefront itself. So again, the solution storefront, like many of the things that we're installing commerce-wise, the solution storefront is used by both the Microsoft Dynamics AX install as well as the Commerce Server install. It's the same solution storefront for both. Obviously the pipelines are different, and in some cases the functionality itself is different. So Dynamics can do certain things that Commerce Server can't, and vice versa. And so we're installing the base solution storefront first, and then we will be installing the Dynamics specific things on top of that. So it's a two-step installation process like many of the other installs that we've been doing today. So we'll go ahead and do that now. So we're going to go to choose file, and we'll go to our reference storefront directory, and we'll go to packages, and we can see here we've got the common and powered by Microsoft Dynamics. So first we'll install that common and look at the package information and install that package. Okay, that's done installing, so we'll now install the next package. Okay, so we'll go back and select our reference storefront with the Microsoft Dynamics required files, and again we'll go through the install steps. And so that installation has completed. And so at this point what we're going to do is we're going to apply those web config changes, and so we'll have that in production, because at this point we now have all of the installs necessary for all the components. So the Commerce Server components, the Dynamics components, the transaction service, as well as the solution storefront, and we can have all of that in our web config file. So we'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll now go to configure what's necessary for the routing service. And to actually configure using the routing service, we're manipulating Sitecore items. So we're going to do that, make those web config changes, and then now log into Sitecore. Okay, so that we can see here on trying to log into our Sitecore site, we're getting an error trying to access that AX Solution Storefront site database. And so the quickest thing to look here is that the login failed for user workgroup W service base. So basically it's trying to log into the database as the network service. So you can either set the permissions correctly on the database in order to allow the Sitecore Commerce Server combined web application to access that database, or the easiest way is simply to go to IIS and within the application pool that your commerce instance is running as, set that to administrator as well. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And that is it. So we'll now try to relaunch our Sitecore application. Okay, so we can now log into Sitecore here. And so we'll go ahead and do that, and we'll launch the content editor. Now what we'll do here is take a look at some of the Commerce Server configuration bits that are necessary for routing. So the first thing to look at is this idea of commerce endpoints. And so if you think about what the routing service is doing is, first of all, it's providing a endpoint for a Sitecore Web API to be called. Secondly, it's providing an endpoint for the file system to be called as well. What's happening here at this point is that it's going to be creating files at this location, and so that's a endpoint for that synchronization service. Now within here we also have a number of root requests. So if we take a look at our Contoso Commerce root request, it in turn is running this root sync Sitecore Commerce channel. And if we take a look at that, these are all the steps that the routing service is performing. And so we can look at this in further detail, but a lot of these steps are basically calling code. And so we'll take a look at this here, and these particular examples of code are tied to Razor templates. And so if you wanted to be adding your own, you can easily reuse some of these, or you can just basically call your own processor type. And so there's a lot of interesting things that are going on here. First of all, it's getting a lot of the channel attributes from Dynamics. It's getting the categories, it's getting the catalogs, it's getting the changed products. It's doing a mapping step, and it's putting all those images into the Sitecore installation and basically mapping that correctly so that you can access the correct GUID for those images. It's rendering that out, it's publishing it, and it'll be calling an import process into Commerce Server. And so that's really, at a nutshell, what's going on here within this commerce synchronization, and so why you have these endpoints, why you have these routes, and those route requests. And so once we can schedule these, so if you look under System and Tasks, we're going to see that commerce synchronization schedule as well. And we'll get in a little bit into how to configure this scheduling so that you understand what the format of the schedule field is, so you can initiate something that's regularly scheduled and run. But what we'll also do right now is, while we're troubleshooting this and making sure this is set up correctly, is we will run this from the command line so that we can actually see those steps being executed in that process. And so this is the overview basically of the moving parts. So we'll get into some of the details and configure what we need to do for all of these endpoints correctly. So that includes things like setting SQL Server references. So this is a login that we need to establish to the channel database, as well as configuring a number of the endpoints correctly as well, so that we can write to those file systems as necessary, and also have the routing service call the correct URL, which in this case is my Sitecore installation. So we're going to set a value for that as well. So we'll do that right now, but I just wanted to give this overview of the different parts of that routing service framework. Okay, so first things first, we're going to look at our commerce endpoint here. And when you install the reference storefront, you're going to get a bunch of examples here. And this is talking to our example Contoso database. And if we look at it, we've got information here for SQL Server. So this does make a SQL Server connection to that channel database. So you need to put in the SQL Server, the database name, and the port. If you are using a trusted connection within the application, if you're launching the connection to the channel database from the Sitecore task, that trusted connection username will be the Sitecore app pool username in IIS. If you're launching this from the console, that will be the user that has initiated that console exe. And so that's the user that's using the trusted connection. In this case here, we're going to use SQL authentication, and so we can put a username and password here. Under images, you may see a number of GUIDs here, and the reason for that is you'll see GUIDs until the point that you import the example images from the Contoso package. So we're going to do that next as the next step, so you can see that your GUIDs will actually become valid Sitecore product paths once those are populated with data. Next is you have your channel ID, and this basically will control which channel you're pulling those products from in that request. Next, we'll take a look at the endpoints here, and these are really specific to the synchronization system in general. So this is something as a framework that can be reused in multiple contexts. However, it is being used specifically for routing in the Dynamics case here. So we have a number of endpoints because what is happening is there is files being written to. So when you're extracting from Dynamics AX, there are XML files that are created and transformed, and at that point that XML file is imported into the Commerce Server catalog. So there's an endpoint for that file system. There is also an endpoint here for the Sitecore system itself. And in this case here, we're actually pointing to our own environment. So you can see Commerce AX, and that is because you could possibly chain routing requests. So you could have one routing initiate another routing. In this case, everything's on the same box, so it's pointing to itself. Now, one thing I will note is that when you're making this request and configuring it here and making a request to the system from the routing console, I'm using the Commerce AX hostname instead of the ax.reference.storefront.com hostname, and the reason for that is because when I'm logging in under Commerce AX, I'm logging in under the website context. When we're logging in under the other URL, we're logging in under the reference storefront context, and the item web API needs the website context. And so any of these references where you are dealing with item web API, you need to be dealing with in the website context, which is actually bound to this hostname. And so that's one thing to be aware of if you are getting errors at the console or at the routing initiation point. It could be that you might be using a Sitecore context that is not the website context. So that is something to be aware of. Okay, now we'll take a look at our actual route requests here. So we have our Contoso Commerce route request, and what that in turn does is call this specific route. We can see here that we have a number of fields and information about whether that's enabled, when it was last run, etc., etc. And in this case here, it is kicking off the sync Sitecore channel. And what this does is in turn executes all of these steps in order using that endpoint. And so theoretically, let's say we're going to pull price or something else from another system, you may have a step within here that is pulling information from a different endpoint, and that's how things are sort of chained up. And you also have something that enables or disables that step. In this case here, all of our steps are enabled, so we're going to get some channel configuration information, we're going to get product attributes, we're going to extract that information, we're going to map, we're going to render, and at that point update some channel history and kick off an import to get that information into Commerce Server. So those are basically the item fields and everything that you need to know about the items for the routing framework inside Sitecore. So we're going to do a few things. We're going to run the update installation wizard here to install the images, and we'll do a number of settings within IIS. So one of the things that I mentioned, we did have to use our Commerce AX domain. We also need to ensure that SSL is configured for that, because the routing service is requiring and communicating over SSL. So we need to go back to IIS to ensure that is lined up. And so there's a few minor changes we need to run, or minor configuration things we need to do. And then at this point, we can run the routing console and see that the entire application is working, displaying content and routing and importing content correctly. Okay, so we're at the update installation wizard again, and basically we'll be installing the last package, which is those Contoso images. And so again, we just run through that installation process, and it will be installing all of those images to Sitecore. This one does take a little bit of time because it's about 70 megabytes worth of images that it's uploading as blobs, and so it'll go through that. And once we complete that, we can go back to the content editor and we can see that we will, for our commerce endpoints, have that correctly configured so that we can see all of those proper image paths within that directory. So now that that's installed, if you go back to that original endpoint, you can see that the product images paths in your instance will be populated with correct paths. Right, so at this point there's a few steps left to do. Right now we've been doing everything in the master database, and we need to get all of this information pushed to the web database. So there's two things you need to do for that. One is do a full site publish. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and either do a smart publish or a republish and all of the languages. And so kick off that publishing operation, and then once that is complete, we're going to do a re-indexing. And so between the publishing, which will publish a number of things that we're going to need on our live site, including the templates themselves, and lots of page structure and content. That's going to push that to the live site. And then the other thing that we need for all of the navigation elements for the reference storefront is the re-indexing, because that information is being pulled live from Lucene or a Solr repository. In our case, it's Lucene, since that's the default out-of-the-box configuration. So between those two things, those last operations, that should ensure that we have everything we need for our reference storefront site, so we can test that in the web database by using the different domain, which is ax.referencestorefront.com. So we'll go ahead and finish this publishing operation and then do a re-index and then go to our live site. Okay, so we finished our publish operation, and we'll now go back to the control panel and go down to the indexing manager, and we're going to kick off a reindex. So you probably want to reindex your core master and web as well as your commerce products, and do a rebuild, and at that point it will start rebuilding those indexes that we need. Okay, so we can see here that that index has now been rebuilt. So we'll go ahead and close that, and we'll now open up a new tab and we'll launch the reference storefront based upon the URL that we set up for that. So that's ax.reference.storefront.com, and at that point we should be able to see our site. So that is now loading correctly. So a few things to point out. Number one, if you're not seeing any navigation here, that means that you need to do a reindex. All of this is coming from that reindexing operation that's driving a lot of this navigation. Number two, if you're not seeing any of these images, you need to run through the installation wizard to install the Contoso update images packages. And so we'll go ahead and click on one of these products, and we will try to add to the cart. Now this on my instance is going to be a little bit slow. My AX instance is basically halfway across the world, so it does take a little bit longer. Typically speaking, you're probably going to be a little bit closer to your AX instance, but that is, you can see this is basically done as an AJAX call, so it is doing that in the background. And similarly, any of those cart requests there, so that product is now added to the cart. If that process had failed, you would see an error message coming up right underneath our top navigation that would indicate probably an issue with that transaction service. So this way we know our transaction service was set up and configured correctly, because all of these calls, anything that's cart related, anything that's order or basket related, is going to through that transaction service and is persisting that cart to the AX repository as well. Now, one more thing, if we click on view cart or checkout, this is now going to an HTTPS version of that. So we need to ensure that we have that certificate set up, and we should have had that set up earlier in the install. If you don't, set that up and make sure that you have an HTTPS certificate. Now this is giving me a warning because of the fact that it is self-signed, but you can say proceed and continue, and this will be one of the steps that we go through later on within this, is to make sure that we can go through that order process and ship those items and actually put in a correct shipping address and city. Now, one thing, at least for our AX instance, we have it configured, it's only accepting United States shipping addresses. So although the solution Storefront does let you pick multiple regions and multiple countries, in fact your actual real world installation, these regions and countries should be trimmed down and obviously in parity with how your AX installation is actually configured. And so we'll go through that and run through that billing process. But at this point, the majority of the installation is complete. We've got the commerce server catalog set up. We've got all their transaction services running correctly. We've got everything bound correctly. We've got the solution Storefront installed. The last thing we need to do now is actually run through the routing framework and test what we've set up and configured. And so we're going to go ahead and use the SDK and the console app for that. I'm going to put this away for now. We'll come back to test the billing step in this after we test our routing framework itself. Okay, so I'm here in my routing console application, and what I've done is I've compiled that. I've ensured that the references were up to date and compiled that and put a copy here on this machine. I don't actually have Visual Studio on this machine, so I have done that elsewhere and dumped the compiled exe here. Now, there is a config file, and so we're going to go ahead and launch that and take a look at essentially the config file has 4 variables. You have your host name, you have your username, you have your password, and which database you're connecting to, whether that's the Sitecore master or web database. And so we'll go ahead and confirm all of those values. Now, I had mentioned earlier that we need to use Commerce 8 AX here. If I had done ax.reference.storefront.com, this routing request will not work because we need to have the website context in order to access all of those Sitecore items that are in the source or the root directories in Sitecore. If we come in using the ax.reference.storefront domain, that is only showing you things in this part of the Sitecore content tree that are relevant to the eStore. So that is really key. Now, the other thing that's really key is this is happening over SSL, and so what we need to do is look at IIS in order to ensure that we have an SSL binding for Commerce 8 AX, that host name that we had set up earlier. So we'll go ahead and look at Commerce 8 AX and take a look at our bindings, and you can see here that we have an SSL binding for that as well. And so both of these are necessary in some respect. This is necessary to have to log in under the Sitecore website context. This is necessary for an SSL version of that in the routing console, and similarly ax.reference.storefront.com, we have our HTTP version, and we need an HTTPS version for those cart operations, and so that's why there's actually those 2 bindings there. And so now if we close that and confirm these settings so we have that correct host name and HTTPS is enabled, we can go back and kick off that console operation. And so what this is doing is this console here is simply initiating that request. All of the configuration for that request is actually stored in those Sitecore content items, and we can see here that is running through those steps that are coming from that Sitecore content operation, and then at that point what it's doing is it's connecting to the AX channel database and it's extracting all of those files, and it is pulling that down and completing the root information. We can go back and kick off that console operation. So we're going to launch the service console and hit the start key and start that synchronization process. So the console is run, and we can now go back to our Sitecore installation and take a look at our commerce synchronization here, and underneath root requests you can see the route that was invoked as well as a request history among that. And you can also see whether or not routing failed or whether or not routing was processed, and you can look at that and look at the log results for each one of those. So hopefully, assuming that you have connectivity all set up and you have the correct channel ID listed, hopefully that root processing will succeed and you'll get an import into your Commerce Server catalogs. And if you look at the catalogs here and the configuration, you can actually see probably additional data from that import, as well as if you go to the catalogs here, you can see a number of additional catalogs that are being pulled from AX. So you can see that we have additional sales, and we have somebody had obviously created a test here in our AX instance, and so those are now synchronized and in that Commerce Server catalog repository as well. And so that's really it for dynamics and ensuring that the routing is correct. And the last step, of course, is in your reference store running through that checkout process. And that checkout process should succeed. Anytime we're adding cart operations, that is calling that transaction service, and it's adding information through that channel database connection in the transaction service. The last thing you need to test for testing the real-time service is the actual creation of an account. So we'll go and do that right now. So we'll go here to our checkout, and we will go and create an account as part of that checkout process. So I'm actually going to go here to register new account and create an example. And when you go through this create user process, it's actually first querying the channel database in order to get the information for the URL for the real-time service, and then it's actually creating that account through the real-time service. So this is one of the more expensive calls for AX. So relative to adding a checkout, it takes a little bit longer, but once it's done that, it will redirect you to your account screen, and that information confirms that the real-time service that you're returning is correct and that you've added that host reference correctly if you needed to do that in order to get the proper URL routing established between Sitecore and AX. Okay, so that is done, and we can now see our account that was created both on the Sitecore side and the AX side. And so that's all of the pieces for Sitecore powered by Microsoft Dynamics AX.